You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Hello and welcome to the US-China Trade War podcast. I am Finbarr Bermingham on the political economy desk at the South China Morning Post. It's the last Friday in August, the sun is out in Hong Kong, and they are just today loosening the coronavirus social distancing regulations, which means that we might even get a drink at the bar tonight. But the metaphorical storm clouds persist and they are getting darker. This week we had new sanctions from the United States on Chinese companies and officials for the militarization of the South China Sea. We saw China fire 4 aircraft carrier killer missiles into the South China Sea, reportedly in response to American spy planes patrolling the area. All the while the trade talks continued in the background, the only sticking plaster holding the superpower relationship together, and that is ironic. We'll have John Carter and Zhou, our political economy editors, on the first half of the show to discuss all the events on this side of the pond. And then, as if that isn't enough, we'll be talking to the great Owen Churchill in our US bureau, who has been diligently glued to the Republican National Convention happening in Washington all week. What did we learn about Trump's election agenda on China? Why were Chinese dissidents speaking to the convention? Are we in for another rocky few months ahead? I think we all know the answer to that last one, but lots more to get through. Let's get on with the show. Joined as ever on this week's podcast by our political economy editors John Carter and Zhou to discuss what's been another very busy week in US-China relations. First things first, we've had new sanctions. The US government announced sanctions on Chinese entities, including the giant state-owned enterprise, the China Communications Construction Companies, CCCC, calling the move a response to Beijing's militarization of outposts in the South China Sea. We've had sanctions on Xinjiang, we've had sanctions on Hong Kong over recent weeks and months. These are coming in thick and fast. John, Zhou, this is another sign of escalation, and it's now sort of gone offshore.
Well, you have to take these new sanctions and all of the sanctions in the context of the U.S. election. Trump is still down more than 8 points in U.S. polls. He was speaking tonight at the end of the Republican National Convention trying to drum up support, but he's behind and he needs to bolster his credentials. And one of his key credentials in the eyes of the American people is his get tough on China strategy. And so this plays into that. We're not even just going to talk about it. We're going to actually do something. Now, these latest sanctions are about the South China Sea. China claims large sections of the South China Sea, even though an international tribunal several years ago said that their claim was not legitimate. And as part of their cementing their claim, they have built up these small island atolls into large islands and fortified them. And this has not gone unnoticed by the world community and particularly the United States. And that's what these sanctions are in response to. Sanctions against Quadruple C could be particularly painful. It has a subsidiary in Texas, an oil company subsidiary in Texas, which holds some interesting patents. And it's unclear if those relations with that company or access to those patents would be affected by these sanctions. In addition, the Quadruple C owns the largest construction company in Australia, which is building the biggest construction project in the country, which is the new metro, the new subway for Sydney. This could have widespread ramifications, particularly if Australia follows up against the Australian construction subsidiary.
Absolutely. Zhou, this is, as we said, it's the latest in a line of sanctioning of big entities. There were actually 24 Chinese state-owned firms added to this list, CCCC being perhaps the most notable. XPCC, the Xinjiang entity, was sanctioned a few weeks ago, and it's been described as a sprawling, maybe not the most transparent of organizations. Zhou, how much of a blow is it to China's industry and industrial economy when big, important companies like this are hit with trade and economic sanctions?
Well, this is really uncharted waters. We have to wait and see whether these companies can survive the US sanctions. I think for XPCC, which has very little overseas operation, the situation might be okay because it's mainly focused on local business. But at the same time, it has to use equipments or systems that involve the US technology or US products. So it's very interesting to see how these companies are going to survive. And basically, one lesson I think Beijing has learned over the past decades, in terms of political, Chinese state-owned enterprises can be very tough, can be speaking very loudly against the United States. But really, once they become targets of US sanctions, what Beijing can really do, or the Chinese can really do to help them, is quite limited. Actually, I remember in the early 1990s, I think the Norinco sold lots of arms to Iraq and Iran, and that put itself under US sanction. And the company basically hired lots of expensive lobbyists, and to solve the problem by themselves. But I don't think any Chinese state-owned company will have this kind of luxury these days, given consideration of the broader US-China tensions. But as we can see, if the US really becomes, if it really becomes determined to inflict pain on a particular Chinese company, I think the US has the ability to do so. Huawei is a very good example.
Absolutely. It was a busy evening the day that the sanctions were announced. We also had the quite worrying news, that there were a couple of missiles fired, Chinese missiles fired into the South China Sea, which a military source close to the PLA told our reporter Kristen Huang were aimed at sending a clear warning to the United States. This was a day after China said a US U-2 spy plane entered a no-fly zone without permission. Zhou, how worrying is this militaristic development? We've sort of alluded to this over recent weeks, that the tension is mounting and, a Cold War is here. Are there concerns in China that there may be a hot war in the offing?
Well, it's very difficult to say this thing about that, but this really is worrying. I think later the U.S. Defense Department has confirmed that there are actually 4 missiles, right, targeting the South China Sea. And apparently China has not officially confirmed that. There has been, but, they're not denying it. So basically it's confirmed that, yes, China do fired missiles, these so-called air carrier killers, into the South China Sea. I think it shows, China is not going to be led by the US in terms of agendas. As sanctions you just described, China is not taking a ticket for tat approach anymore. But for the South China Sea, for this kind of territory sovereignty, China is not backing off. And China is basically showing that, what we are capable of doing. So if you keep sending your warplanes to this area, we have this weapon to destroy your aircraft carriers. But this is also at the same time, you can see that after Beijing fired these missiles, the Chinese government is still very restrained and basically saying we are not targeting the U.S. warplanes. We're just doing this is a legal test of the weapons within China's boundaries, within China's territory. But the message, I think, is quite clear that, China is preparing for these kinds of things. And also given consideration, the unprecedented war exercises along the China coast, from all the way north to Dalian and to south to Hainan. So many Chinese warplanes and vessels are involved in these kind of different military exercises. And I think this is quite a telling. China is saying, please do not play with me on this. I'm really preparing for that.
Yeah, very worrying. The one thing maybe holding things together at the moment is the trade talks. Irony is not lost on us. I think that the main reason Trump attacked China on initially, trade, seems to be the only area for constructive dialogue at the moment. Since we last recorded, we had a telephone call between the top negotiators, Lighthizer and Mnuchin on the US side, Liu He on the Chinese side. They issued some polite statements without giving too much detail as to what went on, but even these polite statements are a lot more decorous than what we're getting elsewhere in the relationship at the moment, John Carter.
Yeah, no, as you pointed out, this is perhaps the only channel of communications between the U.S. and China now that is not highly negative, highly politically charged. The negotiators seem to get along personally. They seem to be dedicated to maintaining the Phase 1 trade deal. And seeing it through, although China remains well below the purchase targets that it agreed to in the deal. So half a loaf is better than no loaf at all, I guess, in this case. But it's very tenuous to have the entire relationship between the two largest economies in the world tethered only by this one agreement, which could easily evaporate at any time, either by the U.S. side or the Chinese side. It's not healthy, and it raises the question of what's going to happen going forward.
Yeah, the Chinese side, China has been buying a lot of US agricultural produce over the past few weeks, and it's nowhere near hitting the target set out in the Phase 1 trade deal, but it's getting closer. For a story that we did this week, I ran a few numbers to look at why might Trump be sort of persisting with this trade deal. And if you look at the top 5 exporting states of soybeans, corn, pork, these really big crops and agricultural produce that China's buying, they are Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, Indiana. All but Illinois are in play in the election. Trump carried Iowa by 9.5% in 2016, and now he leads Joe Biden by just 0.7%. In Nebraska, he won by 25% in 2016, Trump did, and that's been narrowed to just 2% in the latest polls. In Minnesota, Biden has extended a 1.5% victory for Hillary Clinton in 2016 to a 5.8% lead in Minnesota. So the motivation for Trump is clear there. If he wants to win the election, he's trailing in the polls, but if he needs to claw some of that back, and he needs to keep the farmers on side. But what I'm wondering is, Zhou, what is the motivation for China to keep this agreement alive? Is it really just an existential thing in terms of the relationship with the US to keep that alive? Is that mainly the motivation?
Yes, that's the only motivation, I think. For kind of this trade deal at the very beginning, I think for China is, what the US pushing China to do this and that. And China agreed for sake of the broader relationship. And for now, I think this has become more important. That's why even the phone call itself, has significant meanings. According to Chinese media, this showed, China and the U.S. still has room to talk, at least over some specific issues, so you can still sit down and have a friendly, constructive conversation. And also, although the trade talks did not spread out to other topics, for instance, TikTok or other things, but at least we know that there's a vice premier, Liu He, who is a trusted advisor to President Xi Jinping, is giving Beijing's information to the White House, to Washington, and Washington also has a channel to have their concerns and anger, complaints, whatever, to Beijing. So this is important. But as for purchases of grains, for soybeans, I think China is just doing depends on what it needs. And at the moment, China is in need of lots of farm products from the United States. And, with or without, possibly with or without this trade deal, China will import as much soybean as possible, the corns as well, because corn prices in China is rising quite quickly. So yes, China will say, yes, we are honoring our commitments in this Phase 1 deal, and we want to continue to talk with the United States and have a stable or healthy broader relationship. And that's justification for the Phase 1 trade deal in China.
Absolutely. Before we finish up for the day, Zhou, I wanted to ask you about a story which has been very popular on our website this week, the Cyprus Papers piece which you wrote. This is, I'll let you explain it, but just really briefly, leaked documents which showed that 500 Chinese people, mostly very wealthy, obtained European Union citizenship in Cyprus over recent years, including Asia's richest woman. A little bit of a behind the curtain look here, Zhou, at how the other half live.
Well, this is very interesting because we all know that Chinese, the super rich Chinese people are not very comfortable or not very feeling safe about their prospects in China. And this Cyprus paper is just shedding some lights onto this, 500. So it's not everyone have, 2 million euros to spend a passport. And some of them actually have political exposures. They have memberships in local National People's Congress or Political Consultative Committee, which is clearly banned in anti-Chinese regulations. So it's very interesting. But at the same time, some names mentioned, Al Jazeera basically mentioned 8 names, and at least one of them, the China Resources Power president yesterday has come out with the clarifications that he has never applied or obtained any Cyprus citizenship or passport. So this, you can see, this is quite a sensitive issue in China as well, because how can you be a senior executive at the Chinese state-owned enterprises and at the same time you spend 2 million euros to buy your European passport? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the fact that there are so many Chinese willing to put down money for kind of alternative is really worrying, and what worries them is even more interesting. Like, what are you afraid of? With this number 2 economy in the world, you're supposed to be the greatest beneficiaries from China's economic boom. Why you are not feeling safe about your future in this country? So this is kind of really interesting questions, and I really hope that more people named in these by the Al Jazeera database would come out and make their own statements to explain or to clarify.
Absolutely. Before we finish up, John, what's on the agenda for the coming week?
The big one is on Monday. It's the official purchasing managers indexes for the manufacturing and the non-manufacturing sectors. Manufacturing is supposed to improve a little bit more, implying a modest increase in the pace of production. Non-manufacturing is expected to ease a little bit. Non-manufacturing consists of both construction and services. Construction has been very high because of the government's infrastructure building program. Services have been weak, especially among small and medium-sized companies who have struggled to get back into business after the pandemic. So that is the likely reason behind expectation that services and non-manufacturing will ease off in August. But overall, they're expected to show that the Chinese recovery is continuing, is gathering pace, although there is this divergence between the well-to-do and the less well-to-do citizens of the country. It's a problem that Beijing will have to tackle later on.
Absolutely. We'll hear more about that next week. John Carter, Zhou Xin, thank you for your time today.
China tariffs. China had the worst year they've had in 67 years prior China to the plague. Was taking in anywhere between 200 billion with a B and $550 billion from the United States. And before the World Trade Organization and they getting into it, China was flatlined. China will own our country if this guy gets elected. More soybeans than we ever thought possible. And now I have farmers calling me up, sir, we love China very much. Please don't be too tough on them, please.
That was Donald Trump speaking at this week's Republican National Convention in Washington. The president made a number of appearances throughout the week, including a long and quite rambling, as I understand it, closing speech on Thursday evening, Washington time. Owen Churchill has been diligently glued to his laptop all week watching this so that we don't have to. And we're going to catch up with Owen to find out what was said about China and about trade. Delighted to be joined today by Owen Churchill, who is a reporter in the South China Morning Post's US Bureau. Owen has been staying up late this week and following very closely the Republican National Convention. This evening, he's coming in hot. He's just been treated to a fireworks display to signal the end of the convention. And of course, the headline speech from President Donald Trump. Owen, thanks for joining us today. What to you did this tell you about the next few months? Are we going to see a significant change in Trump's agenda on China, or is it going to be more of the same?
Yeah, I think it's basically business as usual when it comes to Trump's position on China and Trump's position on Biden with respect to Beijing. Basically, what we had with this speech, you've got to remember that this was, a well thought through speech. It was pretty, by and large, it was off the teleprompter. It wasn't the usual ad-libbing off the cuff kind of affair. So this was a very intentional and, representative of the campaign's position. And it's worth remembering that the Republican Party this year, for the first time, I think, in modern history, didn't issue a policy platform going into the election, other than to say we completely support Trump. We're going to put all our weight behind him. So this was a really good window into what we can expect for November and leading up to November. But on the whole, it was, he went hard on Biden. He went hard on Biden when it came to trade, jobs, manufacturing, even on the coronavirus. He said, he took no responsibility for that. And he said that he would be the only candidate who would hold China accountable. But it was really a kind of attempt to put the full gamut of US grievances against China on Biden's shoulders, who, as we all know, has been in politics for a very long time, but hasn't been president ever.
Hasn't been president for the past 4 years.
Indeed, yeah. But as I said, everything from trade, jobs, manufacturing, and there was, there was a whole range of, I would say, probably fair comments. He mentioned Biden's support for China's accession to the WTO at one point, all the way through to exaggerations, to half-baked truths, and to a couple of outright lies. We had
sounds like a regular journey into Trump land, that one. How much of how prominent was the China stuff? I mean, I didn't watch it. I heard it was very long. We've been following updates on Twitter, saw the fireworks, of course. Was he dropping in the China stuff throughout the speech? And maybe as a general comment over the course of the week, Owen, have there been like dedicated sections to China throughout this, or is it just generally that China is a percolating theme through the rest of it?
It's been a really prominent theme, especially compared to the Democrats' convention last week. That was something that they got quite a lot of heat from the Republican side. It was mentioned, I think, once in Biden's speech last week, his closing speech, when he accepted his nomination. He said that he was pledging to bring back the manufacturing of medical equipment and medical supplies from China to the US. When it came to the Republicans' convention this week, as we expected, there was a lot of programming about China, trying to pin the blame on China completely for the coronavirus, talking about trade, the phase one deal, really, really trumpeting that side of things. And then in Trump's speech today, it was of the hour, there was maybe a few minutes on China. But, foreign policy in general, it's not a prominent theme. It's not going to be a deciding theme on the whole for voters across the US. But he gave a good chunk of time to that. And then there was, of course, references to, quote unquote, the China virus throughout the speech, which we all know is, a lot of people say that has fueled anti-Asian racism in the US, but he didn't hold back from that.
Totally. Did you hear anything new? I was reading this week the Trump agenda for 2020, and there's a section on China, and I know that he mentioned in the speech that he's going to cut tax credits for companies that bring jobs back, and also ban from federal contracts companies that outsource stuff from China. That's fairly new. Was that a focus of the speech? What else are we hearing?
That was mentioned, and I would say that is probably the most substantive and specific component of what he said on China tonight. There were other parts. He talked about reshoring, bringing manufacturing back out of China. He said at one point that Joe Biden's agenda was made in China. My agenda is made in the USA, which is a stretch in both senses because, and partly because we know that companies are by and large, they're companies that are leaving China are either nearshoring or they're going to places like Vietnam where they can produce goods for more cheaply. And then at the same time, Biden has came out with his democratic platform recently that had quite an extensive section on China, and really went into specifics about trying to rally together an international alliance of countries to push China to uphold and to abide by international norms when it comes to trade.
Interestingly, I was writing about this myself yesterday, and I was doing a quick Control F on the two policy agendas, the platforms, the Biden supply chain platform, and then the Trump general agenda. Trump mentioned China 6 times, whereas Biden mentioned it 10 times. So, I mean, this is, I guess, showing the clear direction in which the wind is blowing in Washington. But and I wonder what your sense is, Owen. If Biden was to win, yes, he maybe didn't go as hard on China in his speech, but he's going to be under pressure to maintain that pressure on China into the new year.
Absolutely. You know, we always talk about this consensus around China that has grown really not rapidly, but it's over the past couple of years, it's really come to the forefront within the Beltway in Washington. That's not going to go away. People I've spoken to on the Hill are pretty adamant that there is going to be support for a very a hardline approach to Beijing, basically on everything. But I think that's something we will probably see more of if Biden did win in November. I don't think there's a lot of space for him to back down on trade necessarily. Although he's talked about the damage that tariffs have done for consumers and for companies in the US. But as his platform laid out, he wants to try and kind of rally together allies and use the international community more effectively. But I think beyond trade, you're going to see a lot more movement on matters around human rights. And that's something that Trump himself doesn't speak to all that often, although his administration has taken steps to sanction Chinese officials, Chinese entities over things like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. But I think that the Biden realizes he has taken a lot of flack because of his role in the Obama administration. And dissidents who I speak to who are not necessarily pro-Trump, they acknowledge that there was this sense of human rights being somewhat sidelined in the previous administration, not necessarily to the degree of appeasement, but that they didn't take as central a position as they should have. And I think we're seeing Joe Biden become more and more vocal about things like Xinjiang. He called it a genocide, recently, and that's language that we haven't seen even from Pompeo.
Yeah. That's a real, I think, a Rubicon moment there to be calling it a genocide. You don't see that from many international leaders, let alone the prospective leader of the United States. One of the highlights from this end, anyway, during the week was to see the exiled human rights activist Chen Guangcheng take the platform at the RNC. You did a nice little story on this the other day, Owen. Tell us a bit of background about Chen. What was he doing there? What was he saying? And what was the backlash to this, in this part of the world, very well-known Chinese figure taking the stage at the RNC in America?
Yeah, so for those who aren't too familiar with his story, he came to the US in 2012 after being persecuted on and off by authorities for many years back in China. He was a self-trained legal activist. And he ended up in house arrest and managed to escape to the US embassy. And ultimately, the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, was quite involved. Gary Locke, the US ambassador to China, they facilitated his release from China to the US, where he's lived ever since. And since then, he has become more and more associated with the right when it comes to the US political spectrum. I spoke to him over a year and a half ago when I was working on some reporting about support for Trump within the dissident community. And his position is very representative of, quite a surprisingly large contingent of that community that say Trump, yes, he doesn't speak to human rights in particular, and yes, he has praised Xi Jinping numerous times and called him a friend and so on, but he's the only president who appears to not back down when it comes to confronting Beijing. And they think that even through things like economic pain, he could ultimately, cause the Communist Party in China to kind of lose its grip on power. And Chen Guangcheng, his appearance at the convention, it rocked a lot of boats over here in the US because, there are people in the dissident community who think that there's too much inconsistency when it comes to the political right and particularly Trump's strain of politics and what human rights advocates are fighting for. And I spoke to his former lawyer, Teng Biao, who is also an exiled lawyer here in the US. He represented Chen when he was back in China, and he was really saddened by the whole thing. There's a perception, I think, amongst a lot of activists that Chen has been kind of co-opted somewhat by the political right, and I'm sure that he and his allies would dispute that. Sadly, he didn't want to talk to me about that this week. But there is a perception that he has been somewhat co-opted and used almost as like a shield for Trump and Trump's allies to say, no, we do care about human rights. Look who we've brought to the convention.
Here's our Chinese activists who, we're putting on the platform. Yeah.
Yeah. And Trump himself, he tweeted a video of Chen speaking soon after he took to the stage.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see some of these figures pop up in US politics. Say we had Guo Wengui, of course. Steve Bannon, was he arrested on his yacht? I mean, it does seem quite weird to see these two worlds colliding now.
Yeah, everyone talks about it as like the weirdest of bedfellows, and it's just a very kind of, I don't know, it's a very 2020 moment, when it came to Bannon being arrested by postal agents on Guo Wengui's super yacht. It was, just so many stories colliding together there.
Totally.
But I think it's and it's a matter of converging objectives. There are things that I think both sides have to kind of compartmentalize and brush aside when it comes to these kinds of alliances.
Very much the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Owen, I wanted to ask you about the coming months. Election season is in the US, but as a reporter, it must be a bit frustrating to sort of have to cover this. Not as maybe firsthand as you'd like. I mean, obviously the restrictions are in place. Things aren't going to be motoring as usual, but have you got a busy agenda, a busy schedule reporting on this over the coming months?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, this is the first time for everybody covering an election where it's all almost exclusively remote. It's given people who are involved in the election, people who are running for office, both at the presidential and at the local level, they're not speaking face to face with voters, but they're almost, they're reaching even more intimately into their lives because it's more of like everyone talks about it being more of like a one-to-one conversation. And so it's actually, I think it was, in a way, the conventions this year, there was it was more possible to focus on the substance of what people were saying. I think that people are going to realize that they need to really be pushing for sharp agendas and really talking to the issues. You can't rely, unless you're Trump and you have the White House South Lawn as your venue,
yes.
There's not a lot of showboating that you can do. You can't whip up, huge crowds. And so that's quite refreshing as a reporter. But certainly it's frustrating doing this from the living room every day in, day out.
Yeah, we all empathise with that one, Owen. But look, great to have you on the podcast. We look forward to reading what you're reporting on over the next weeks and months. And take care over that side of the pond.
Cheers, Finbarr.
Thanks for listening to this week's US-China Trade War podcast with me, Finbarr Bermingham, on the SCMP's Political Economy Desk. You can follow us on Twitter at SCMP Economy. I'm at F Bermingham. That's Birmingham with the B-E-R, not like the city. We'll be back same place next week. Until then, wash your hands, keep your distance, wear your mask, and stay safe and healthy.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.